Okay, we can go ahead and probably get started, and then some folks can filter in. Um, I first of all want to thank the panelists and thank our guests for joining us tonight for our pre-debate panel and conversation. I especially appreciate the fact that many of you are watching us here instead of what is sure to be a dramatic final presidential debate. However, part of the point of this panel is to step back and consider the role of statewide office holders. So before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am currently at PLU and moderating from the traditional lands of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, and Stilican peoples. And I acknowledge and respect the traditional caretakers of this land. I realize that many of you are in different places right now, so I would encourage each of you to research the traditional caretakers of the land on which you currently sit. This is an insufficient but necessary first step in the process of reconciliation. So tonight, as we prepare for the Lieutenant Governor debate, I want to acknowledge the hard work that students in my Writing 101 class and Dr. Eckstein's Communication 215 class did in promoting this event and in creating excellent resources for folks interested in this important race. The students created a website that's a helpful resource in identifying the key responsibilities of the Lieutenant Governor office, the issue positions of the candidates, and other material that would be useful to voters considering how to fill out their ballot with respect to this particular race. The title of the website is The Real Race for Washington, and the students have made a strong case for this being true. The argument goes as follows: the gubernatorial race is not exactly a close one, and assuming Biden wins the presidency, it's possible that the next lieutenant governor will serve at least until a special election as the next governor if, for example, Inslee is selected to serve in a Biden administration in some capacity. However, even if this doesn't come to pass, the lieutenant governor has a number of really important responsibilities: serving as the governor when the governor is out of state, serving as the head of the Senate, serving as part of several important committees with the state legislature, and chairing the Legislative Committee on Economic Development and International Relations. So tonight, as we prepare to hear from the candidates, Denny Heck and Mark Elias, this evening, we have the privilege of hearing from an excellent panel of experts. I'm going to introduce each panelist and ask them to respond to an initial question related to their area or areas of expertise. And after that, we're going to move to a conversation with the whole panel. If you have any questions at all, I'd ask you to submit them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of our panel discussion, we should have plenty of time to address many of your questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to start off by recognizing Dr. Bernadette Calafell, Chair and Professor in the Department of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at Gonzaga University. She is the author of Latino Communication Studies, Theorizing Performance and Monstrosity, Performance and Race and Contemporary Culture, co-editor of 4 books, Latino Discourse in Vernacular Spaces, Somos de Una Voz, Queer Intercultural Communication, The Intersectional Politics of Belonging in and Across Differences, Negotiating Identity and Transnationalism, Middle East and North African Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, and De-Whitening Intersectionality, Race, Intercultural Communication, and Politics. Bernadette is also the editor-elect of the Journal of International and Intercultural Communication and film review editor of QED, a journal in GLBTQ worldmaking. Dr. Calafell, thank you for joining us tonight. Would you mind talking briefly about organizing the debate for this evening and the way in which principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion informed that process?
Sure, thank you for the question. Sorry about the muted microphone for a second. So basically, we work with the Seattle City Club, which is a nonprofit organization, and the Washington State Debate Coalition, which is a part of that group, to organize and collaborate with local media on the debates and coming up with questions that are representative of not only the issues that affect the entire state of Washington, but also its various constituencies. And a part of that, which is where I come in, is in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which is composed of myself, Dr. Justin Eckstein of Pacific Lutheran University, and Dr. Leilani Nashemi of University of Washington. And one of the things we do is we work together on these questions, and we consider how issues of DEI are reflected or not reflected in what's going on in the questions. So how are historically marginalized groups or historically underrepresented groups present or represented in these questions? How are issues of power and racial justice and equity present or not in these questions? How can we nuance these questions in ways that are attentive to the issues that affect these communities? And so this is one of the ways that we kind of chime in to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are a part of the dialogue throughout. So we really want to nuance these questions to make sure that these communities' voices are represented, because often they're not. And so that's our role in this process. So it's really a collaborative process that we're involved in. Oops, I think you're muted.
Yes, I made a rookie mistake there. So next I'd like to introduce Dr. Amy Young. Amy Young is Professor of Communication and Chair of the Department of Communication at Pacific Lutheran University. Her scholarly research investigates how experts use rhetorical style to translate their work for public audiences so they can better address issues of significance in cultural, social, and political life. She teaches courses in strategic communication, or how organizations communicate both with internal and external audiences. And more recently, she's taught courses in media studies and visual culture. When she's not on the clock, Amy is a pretty gifted cook, a sometime baker, athlete, wine enthusiast, mom, and Twitter doom scroller. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Young. As an expert in communication, if you were advising the candidates tonight, what advice would you offer them?
Thank you so much for having me on this panel and for the opportunity to talk a little bit about this. I think debate this season has been sort of fraught, so I look forward to something slightly less fraught for this evening. And I think because of Washington's top two primary system, in which both of these candidates are Democrats, this provides opportunities, and it also provides challenges for how they probably should communicate about themselves. So I have taken a few notes. I'm going to kind of move through those. I think one of the first things we want to think about is the audience. So we want to think about who Heck and Leas are talking to. Washington's ballots went out almost a week ago, and given the trajectory of enthusiasm, a number of people have already voted. So these candidates are not talking to everyone, but mostly to the folks who have not yet cast a ballot. Some of those people are partisan Democrats, some are independents, and some are Republicans. And I think each of these audiences may want to hear something different from the candidates. So Democrats are interested in what sort of vision each candidate lays out. And they're interested in hearing the candidates articulate their legislative priorities and policy preferences. Where do they overlap? Where do they diverge? And I think independents and Republicans are watching and listening for something else. So how does each candidate speak to people who probably didn't vote for them in the primary? How do they speak to issues that are most pressing in ways that reassure non-Democrats that that candidate really understands all of Washington's voters and not just the ones who may have carried them from primary to the general? I think also this is an opportunity for distinction. Since both candidates are Democrats, this debate presents a challenge and an opportunity to create that distinction. And I would hope to see candidates note where they find policy overlap, as is true in the case of creating a more progressive tax structure in the state. That's something they both agree on. And also spaces where they do not overlap, like healthcare. So one prefers Medicare for all, and the other prefers expanding the Affordable Care Act and a single payer. So some of this is also a distinction in generation. Heck is a politician with a national reputation and has served Washington for decades. Leas is newer and has always been locally focused. And finally, I think voters are very tired of rancor and divisiveness in tone. So if I were to offer any sort of advice, and I should say I'm the odd rhetorician that never debated, so this is not probably advice that anyone particularly cares about from me, but as a voter in Washington State and somebody who's interested in the field of communication, I would hope that their tone is something that is more collaborative rather than combative. That does not mean, of course, that they need to agree. It doesn't mean that they don't need to present the differences in their record or their priorities or their styles or their approach to governance. And as you mentioned, given that it's possible that their style of governance is going to matter differently than it matters for just this ballot, I think voters are interested in hearing that. But it does mean that it's refreshing, right, to hear adults speaking to other adults about issues that are really important in this state. So how are we handling coronavirus? How are we creating a tax system that is more just and more fair for all Washingtonians, right? What are we doing about things like wealth inequality and homelessness, drug addiction, other kinds of things that are really significant? Voters actually want to hear about those things, but they'd like to hear about them from adults. So that's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Matt Lovelace. Matt is the lead producer for Northwest Public Broadcasting's Vote 2020 coverage. In addition to moderating a number of debates for local, legislative, and statewide races, he'll produce and host an election night special for NWPB. Mr. Lovelace is also a member of the Washington State University faculty, teaching senior level broadcast news reporting courses. He spent almost 15 years in television news and sports, covering elections since the 2004 Gregor Rossi governor's race, as well as politics across the state of Idaho, and worked 7 years as a sports and news anchor in Illinois. Thank you for joining us tonight. And could you talk briefly about the role of the moderator in tonight's debate? Is it simply to ask questions and let the candidates control the substance, or is it to serve as sort of the chief fact checker?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on here tonight. It is fun to not have to moderate tonight's debate, whether it be the presidential or the lieutenant governor debate. But that's a good question, because I think we certainly had a lot of opinions about the first presidential debate, how that was moderated. I felt for the guy just because I didn't have to deal with any kind of tactics, we'll say, that he had to deal with. But I do think a good moderator for a debate has to be well researched. In fact, ahead of tonight's debate, I imagine we had all watched, maybe rewatched the previous debate or debates between Mr. Heck and Mr. Leas. I certainly did. And so as a moderator, you need a sense of, have they changed their stances? Have they softened their tone on issues? Certainly, as Dr. Young pointed out, we have a top 2 primary here in Washington State where 2 Democrats can move on to the general election. And there's a lot of research that goes into what political rhetoric looks like in a campaign that has that ability to shut out a major party. And so I think you need to pay attention as a moderator to whether or not they've softened their tone on issues and things like that. What are the candidates saying differently? I also think a good moderator is just a good listener. This seems obvious, but it's also a learned skill. This is why experienced journalists are so often pressed into these duties. It's a skill to be able to drive a program, and they are TV programs, or even drive an interview forward, still listen to what's being said. You don't want to just go, all right, stop talking, let's move on. I think a bad moderator doesn't repeat phrases they hear or things like that. So I think a well-moderated debate is able to highlight some of a candidate's talking points, guide question phrasing and rebuttal responses in a way that you're trying to get candidates to address each other's talking points. So you need to be adaptable. And really, this is no different than how we should be talking to our spouses and significant others. I'm listening to you. Here's what I'm responding to. So I think it's good to know that I heard what you said. Let's build this discussion. Let's drive this discussion rather than having this sort of really impersonal, fragmented program. Now, as for the second part of your question, as for being the chief fact checker, I'm a little uncomfortable with that. And in part, I don't want to hold that to the moderator because it is a TV program. We have time parameters and we're sort of worried about other things. That first presidential debate got out of hand. Even when Chris Wallace did what he could to sort of wrangle in the candidates, it just wouldn't be reasonable for him, especially at that level, to be on the internet, going beyond the bounds of what he'd already researched while trying to manage adults not talking to each other like adults. And so I think that would be really hard for him to be the chief fact checker in that sense. But it also depends on the debate. Certainly my experience is varied. I did statewide races. I think the most contentious debate I moderated was for the state treasurer position. And that was a surprisingly heated debate, in my opinion. But I've also done county level races, legislative races, very different from presidential debates. But even Wallace shared his regrets afterwards. He said he'd wished he'd controlled that debate from a civility and a substance perspective more from the get-go. And at that level, I do think he needs to focus on that. There should be a team of fact checkers doing that work behind the scenes. In fact, I know some of them, as we're doing this right now, are furiously following President Trump and Mr. Biden's comments during the presidential debate, and they need to be in the moderator's ear when something is worth bringing up. So as far as being a chief fact checker, I don't know, that's putting a lot on a moderator who's really just trying to drive a conversation, but I do think they really need to be a part of that conversation, listening to the candidates and paying attention to things that are maybe incongruent with what they've said before.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Riley Dolan. Riley is the statewide student engagement coordinator for the Washington Student Association, where he coordinates the Get Out the Vote campaign for member colleges across the state and ensures the newly legally mandated student engagement hubs run smoothly for the 2020 election. Riley is a PLU graduate with a BA in political science and Hispanic studies. Before this role, Riley has worked as the student engagement coordinator for the Washington Student Engagement Networks, the civic engagement director at PLU, and as a Fulbright scholar in Guatemala. Thank you for joining us tonight, Riley, and welcome back to PLU. Could you take a moment to talk about the work that you're doing to get young folks involved in politics in the state, and what sort of barriers you've seen to getting folks more engaged in the process?
Sure. Yeah, so we've been doing some really exciting work engaging with students. Part of it is just traditional texting and phone calls to students, and just on the ground anecdotally, that's been going really well. We've been getting great response from students, a lot of them saying that they've already voted, which is great since ballots haven't even been out for a full week yet. And then along with that, we're doing these new things, the student engagement hubs. So those are newly mandated by law in the state of Washington, and all public universities will be having them. And at these, students will be able to register to vote in person up to and including on election day. They can submit their ballot through a ballot drop box. They have voter information available as well, so they can look at the voter's guide and vote. So that's some of the work that we've been doing, and we have more events coming up to help get out the vote with our student population. But when it comes to barriers to engagement, there's kind of two different types of ways that I classify these barriers. That some of the barriers for students and for younger people getting engaged with politics and voting is kind of just logistical. Young people and students move around a lot, and every time you move, you have to update your voter registration address. And you know, the young people and students typically have a lot busier schedules as well, so it can be a lot more difficult to maybe find the time to make a well-informed vote. But then there's also kind of systemic issues that I see as well. Part of it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes with campaigns where they see that young people and students aren't voting at higher rates, so then they don't try to engage those populations as much, or they aren't looking at issues that these populations care about. Something that we're really excited about is that we have candidates that are supporting things like the Washington College Grant, childcare, mental health care, and food and housing insecurity. These are all issues that students really care about in general, and it can really help drive our turnout when we have candidates that we can be excited to vote for.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I have a few questions to ask before kind of turning things over to the audience. As a reminder to the audience, as you have questions, add them to the Q&A, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. So my first question to the panel as a whole is, there's always a lot of attention paid to the presidential race. Why don't we see the same level of interest in state and local races? And is there anything that can be done to sort of increase enthusiasm for these really important races that are being held in state and local politics?
I'll take a shot. I think that part of the reason is likely financial resources that the larger campaigns have that smaller campaigns do not. It's not necessarily true, for instance, of our US senators or US congresspeople or our gubernatorial race, or maybe even this one. But certainly the smaller legislative races, the city council races, the ones, and what's alarming, of course, is that these races really matter to people, and they matter in their everyday life in ways that very frequently the presidential race does not. And yet we just don't see them. So I think part of the problem is money in politics, and the sort of visibility that giant sums of money can buy certain candidates and certain races that it cannot buy others.
And I would add to that, because I actually just had a conversation with a student. I forced them to watch the governor debate from a couple of weeks ago and do an assignment on it, because we're going through a whole, I mean, obviously, what a great time to do lessons on covering politics and elections right now. And he goes, that was the first time I'd ever seen Lauren Culp. And so really, I mean, it comes from funding. It also, there's a responsibility among local journalists. And certainly one of the things we try to do in our partnerships with the League of Women Voters in Benton and Franklin counties in Washington State, there are some candidates, you know, the Benton County Commission races, the Franklin County PUD Commissioner, we had a forum for them. What other time would we have ever seen them speak about certain issues? And I think debates, and I know we'll probably talk broader just about the effectiveness of debates in general, but I think debates are really instructive just to see what the person looks like when they're talking about whatever issues they believe in. So we have voter guides. I think people's behavior drives a lot of interest in terms of elections, which is probably why you'll see a pretty big turnout for this presidential election. A lot of people are voting on the issue of behavior. And so we just I don't think we can compel as many people to vote that way if they don't know who the people are. So to my student who thanked me for being able to see the debates, I don't know if that changed his mind in any way, but you know, it was the first time he'd ever seen Lauren Culp. And that stuck with me as I was preparing for this very forum. I was like, you know, it's incumbent upon him to do some research, but a lot of people kind of want it brought to their eyes. And I think that's really important for local journalism.
I think one of the things that I tell my students is that a lot of times folks tend to think that social change has to happen on this grand scale, right? And that's always at this national level, right? So I think in the public imaginary, a lot of folks see that, and that kind of drifts their attention away from what's happening at the local. And so that's kind of how I see it, at least from my perspective.
Yeah,
What have you seen?
that there are really great changes that we can get on a state and local level. One great example of this is the Washington College Grant, which greatly expands the financial aid in the state. And there were a lot of students getting involved and engaged in their local and state politics through that. And I think the more that we're able to continue our messaging and students are able to realize the impact that the state is having on their education and the access that they have to it, people will continue to be interested in local politics.
Great, great, thank you. Yeah. Next, as Matt was saying, we do want to talk about the role of debates, since we're about to watch one tonight. What role do you see debates playing in the political process? Do you think debates change the minds of potential voters? And I'm asking that question from the perspective of a political scientist, and political scientists are always very skeptical that debates can influence anybody. But what are your takes on the role of debates in this election process?
Well, I'm happy to start just because I've handled a couple of them, and I think there's also a discussion in terms of local versus national here. So I think locally, sure they do, and largely because most of us don't hear about the candidates other than what we find out during an election. I do think to some small degree, we're all one-issue voters. And by that, I mean one thing that if a candidate took a hard stance one way or another, we might be inclined to go, ooh, I don't like how we said that, or I don't like how, that stance there. And certainly for a lieutenant governor race between two Democrats, I do think there's a lot of value in sort of positioning yourself on the left spectrum. Where are you? Because these are two different candidates despite being part of the same party. So at the presidential level, I don't think debates change minds in maybe a way we would traditionally think about it. Oh, I'm going to flip from Biden to Trump or Trump to Biden tonight. Personally, I've struggled with an understanding of the undecided voter in this presidential election. It seems hard to believe that you haven't decided which candidate you'd prefer of the two. But I will say this, and I saw some good perspective from a political reporter for Yahoo News, that the swing voter, at least in this race, isn't somebody who's still deciding between Trump and Biden. It's the person trying to decide if it's worth voting for either or at all. And I think these debates exist as a chance to compel those who would rather leave the ballot in the mailbox this year to get off the couch, fill it out, and send it in. And I think that's probably the only value of the presidential debates at that level at this point in the election.
I agree actually with absolutely everything Matt said, and it was very well articulated. I would say we do know that presidential debates almost never move anyone's opinion, and so what is the function? And I think to kind of bring it back to a point that Matt had made earlier about behavior, one of the things that I do think that debates can do, and maybe that's what gets you off the couch to pick it up and fill it out and do whatever it is that you're going to do, is illuminate a sort of pattern of response tendencies and behavior, and that suggests what sort of leader you might be or are. And that to me might matter. And I think at least this year, one of the sort of unusual things is, of course, that we're all doing this in wherever we are technologically. And it makes me wonder if people are paying more attention to debates because there's less to pay attention to. We're not out doing other things. And the reason we're not out doing other things is a very key issue that people are interested in hearing about in these debates. So I do wonder if, because there isn't a ton of other cross-programming in people's lives, maybe they are paying more attention.
Yes, and I agree with everything that's been said, so I don't know if I have so much to add, but I think a lot of times the historically marginalized communities of color, want to see that they're even on the radar of these candidates, right? The issues of representation, nuance and complexity and understanding of the needs of the community. At least that's what I see part of this, not only the utility of the debate, but why folks are tuning in at all.
Absolutely.
There's a role, the moderator has an important role there. Sorry, a really quick interjection just in terms of, I did Benton and Franklin County. If we don't address the topic of immigration and DACA, we haven't done our job. in that debate. So you want to make sure that in these debates, we are addressing issues that are important to the community.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd just like to add in, I agree with Matt that really the swing voter is the person deciding whether they want to vote or not. And I just want to like be clear, at least in my view, that it's not so much of, you know, these people finding the motivation, you know, or getting up off the couch in the literal sense, but actually being convinced by a politician that they have their true interests at heart. And young people and students today are the most diverse population in our history in the US. And, you know, historically marginalized communities can get a lot of, you know, talking to and promises by candidates, but not that follow through. So in this debate and all debates in the future, I hope candidates are able to point towards their specific record and actions that they've taken, rather than just, you know, rhetoric and paying lip service.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I certainly talk about a lot in class, is that there's at least a lot of evidence that, you know, the sort of traditional depiction of young people as sort of apathetic and uncaring is just not true, and that they're actually deeply engaged and deeply concerned and substantially more tolerant than other generations, and it is convincing them that the system is worth engaging with, that they're doing all this work is something like voting, a complement to that. In terms of finding information, so this has been touched on a little bit, where can folks find good, reliable sources of information about local races, particularly in a time in which local news is not as widespread as it once was, and there's lots of financial pressures being placed on local news organizations?
Is this a question for the local newsman first? Do you want me to start again?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's tough for me even. You know, I'd like to think of myself as an informed voter, but you go down a ballot and go, oh no, I don't know anything about this race. And I think we all sort of encounter that, especially if you got a lot of them on there. But I do think voter guides are helpful to a degree. I always read through them. At least you get a snapshot. As I mentioned earlier, we're all in a way sort of one issue voters, where if somebody believes something or doesn't, you know, that's really instructive. And usually you get that snapshot. If you're looking for a little more depth, of course, I do think the voter guide tends to be obviously full of things that are written by the candidates, submitted by the campaigns. So you'll find out where candidates stand on issues there. Personally, I've liked Ballotpedia online. This election, no articles, just kind of straightforward biographies, voting records, committees they're on, and so forth. You can kind of infer their priorities there. Am I allowed to plug public broadcasting? Is that too self-serving there? I say seek your public broadcasters nearby. You know, there is research that shows people who are exposed to news on public TV are better informed, they're likelier to vote. Maybe their views on society are a little more realistic. Strong public broadcasters usually report more trustworthiness from their readers and viewers. People who live in areas with strong public broadcasting are less likely to have extremist political views. And so I just say seek out as many sources as you can. I think a lot of people, too many people, settle on whatever source they already liked. And that's, of course, very dangerous. So you really have to find a diversity of opinions and, you know, articles. I think you can trust local journalism as well. With the people who are on the ground doing these types of stories, at least you get to know what the candidates, you know, what's important to them.
I think the other thing I want to take a little tangent here is to think about media literacy, right? And especially I want to plug again the Washington State Debate Coalition, because they have produced materials that help educate the public about, you know, the debates, viewing the debates, questions to think about and such. So I think another part of that is this question of media literacy and debate literacy in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with that. And I think part of media literacy can include looking at the broader topics of where are these media outlets getting their funding, unfortunately, it can be a little bit difficult to find that information, or once you do find it, it can be disappointing. For example, I know that Como 4 is owned by Sinclair, which is kind of more of a conservative group. And so that can influence how they cover certain topics. But when it comes to getting reliable information, it's also important to talk about where we don't get reliable information. And I think social media, unfortunately, is a place where there's a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, I'm just going to chime in here and say media and information literacy is super important, and source credibility and understanding what are the characteristics of what constitutes a credible source. One of them, of course, being peer review and not someone screaming from their basement. So I think to Riley's point and to Matt's point about sort of extremism, and to Professor Calafell's point just about media literacy in general. And I would also just add, sometimes I find, aside from the state voter guide, there are other organizations that usually have a partisan tilt that also produce voter guides, and sometimes those I found are valuable. And I found particularly for this race that the Fuse Washington Voters Guide was really valuable, because if you're looking at two Democrats, it's interesting to see how a progressively tilted voting guide talks about candidates that are in their team.
That's great. That's really helpful. And as you all were talking, some good resources were being shared in the chat. So so Justin Eckstein shared some information from the Washington State Debate Coalition that folks should check out, like Dr. Calafell was sharing just a moment ago. And I shared a link that is that was for a website that was created by our students that I was talking about earlier. That includes a student-generated voter guide for the lieutenant governor race. So it discusses their positions on some of the key issues facing the state. So hopefully, if you're watching this, you'll find that to be a helpful resource as you watch the debate this evening and as you fill out your ballot. I had another question before we turn things over to the audience. Thinking specifically about this race, as we've talked about before, this race is between two Democrats. And so what major disagreements do you see arising between the two candidates in tonight's debate?
We know some of them. We know, for instance, and I would say that it's not necessarily that there's some sort of chasm between what candidates think about the ends, but the means to achieve those ends can be a little bit different. I think that healthcare is a space where we know they have a difference of opinion, and whether we should expand the Affordable Care Act or whether we should enact a Medicare for all kind of program in the state. I think those are important questions, and they're particularly relevant even to non-Democratic voters in the middle of a pandemic when many people have lost their jobs, which means they also have lost employer health coverage, and it shows the limits of a private healthcare system. And, I think that I think probably on the environment, these candidates are different. I'm expecting not so much that there's a huge rancor about, whether we should pay attention to the environment or to healthcare, but maybe in what way do we attend to it?
There's certainly a couple other issues. I mean, just in terms of kind of the sense you get certainly from Mr. Leas is that he's sort of more on the progressive side of things. He really wants to hit the ground running on a number of the issues that he seeks. I think he's even been critical of Mr. Heck on being more moderate, a more moderate Democrat. And then we also hear things about state income tax. They both support it in some way. Certainly Mr. Leas speaks more in terms of taxing the wealthy. In fact, I think in the last debate, he gave a threshold number, 250 to 400,000, is when we begin to implement a state income tax on those earnings in the state. So I think you're just seeing, I mean, it's unsurprising if you know where you're coming from in terms of where those two sort of lie on that Democratic spectrum. But certainly there's a little bit more progressive, aggressive approach from Mr. Leas. And Mr. Heck, you'll hear him talk a lot about his experience, because when you're from the same party, that's sort of the one thing that you want to hold over your opponent's head, which of course is what we'll hear a lot about tonight.
Well, thank you all for such insightful comments and thoughts this evening. I want to turn things over to our audience, and as a reminder, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. We do have a couple of questions. One is Charlene asks, is voter suppression something to be worried about in Washington State?
That's a great question. So I'd say, kind of speaking towards what I talked about in my introduction, that there's kind of two different types of barriers to voting. So I'd say on the logistics side of thing, Washington is doing really well, particularly within these recent years. And the WSA really helps support and get these bills passed for things like same-day voter registration. So you can register to vote on election day, and pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. And now these newly mandated student engagement hubs, and we're really excited to see how those can increase voter turnout. So when it comes to the actual access to voting, we're doing a really good job in Washington compared to other states. I think voter suppression, though, has a different form that it takes place, where students and young people, again, might not feel like they believe in the system, so they don't want to participate in it through voting. And I think that's where our politicians and candidates can do a great job of showing that they do care, both through their words, but through the actions that they take as well, and the policies that they support.
And if there is a voter suppression effort going on in Washington State, they're doing a terrible job, because the most recent numbers show 33% of ballots are already in. We're in the day 3 of counting. Almost 1.6 million people have voted. At this point, 4 years ago, it was 574,000, 13%. So a third of the ballots are already in, which is an incredible number. And if it continues that growth, which it has the first few days of these ballots being counted, the turnout's going to be remarkable for the state.
I think nationally too, the number of sort of mail-in absentee ballots that have been collected so far already surpasses the amount that were collected in 2016. So yeah, turnout seems to be particularly high. Before shifting off that point, I also wanted to ask a question about misinformation and disinformation on this topic. There's a lot of just bad information about voting that spreads online, and sometimes from the mouths of politicians themselves. What can individuals do to combat that kind of bad information about voting so that people feel secure in casting their ballot?
One of the things that we hear a lot is George Lakoff's truth sandwich suggestion, right? Which is to call out the untruth, provide the truth, remind of the untruth, right? So we're creating this kind of sandwich where we say that is actually not the case. Here is what is the case. Reminder that this is not the case. So I think that's one of the things that people can do as a technique. And I know that, there is a lot of bad information out on social media, but one of the things that I have seen people doing really effectively is sharing their experience with things like mail-in voting, especially people in states both Republican and Democrat, and I've seen this from people in Utah, which tends to be a pretty Republican-leaning state, and Washington, which does not. It works for people, right? And there isn't some sort of widespread conspiratorial attitude generally about mail-in ballots here because we've just become accustomed to them. So sharing your experience with voting by mail, or what other forms of voting people do, I think can be a way to put a face to something that's recognizably more in line with empirical reality than some of the cuckoo pants stuff that we hear and see.
I agree with.
Oh yeah, sorry, Riley.
I just wanted to add in, kind of relates to the previous question as well. WSA partnered with WSU, and we hosted a Q&A with Secretary of State Kim Wyman. And in that, she was actually pretty explicit, even though she's a Republican herself, in criticizing the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself for kind of casting this doubt around mail-in ballots. And that can be a form of voter suppression as well, where the attitudes around mail-in ballots is that they're going to be falsified or something like that, and some people won't vote as a result.
Thank you. Justin Eckstein asks a question specifically to Dr. Calafell. And he says, about broader politics, what is your take on President Trump's insult of Senator Harris as a quote unquote monster?
So I saw this question coming, so this is great. So,
it was in the chat, yeah.
So this is great. So as I mentioned, or as was alluded to in my biography, a lot of the work I've been doing recently has been around monstrosity. And specifically, I'm interested in the ways that women of color have been otherized or seen as these monstrous figures. And we can tie this back to specifically chattel slavery and the way that African American or Black women were masculinized. We're seeing there's this narrative of the strong Black woman, but also they were seen as these scary others, especially in relationship to white femininity, right? So the fact that Donald Trump would call Kamala Harris is very predictable, and calling her a monster, right, is very predictable in a long line of ways that women of color have been seen as threats or excessive, right? So yeah, I think Trump, he took a script from the oldest racist playbook there was, that's at least my take on it. Who knows, maybe you'll see something an op-ed or something come out of this, but thanks for the question.
I also wanted to ask, I got asked this question recently, and I had an answer, but I don't know that I have a great answer to this question. So we're seeing this race between two Democrats tonight. Is the Republican Party dead in Washington state? What is the future of the Republican Party going forward in Washington? What do you think?
I'm actually a native of Washington, so I'll go with this. And I'm in my mid 40s, so I remember Republicans in Washington. This is not a state that has been some Democratic stronghold for as long as people might assume it has. And in fact, it has had a lot of shared governance throughout its history. And I mean, when I was a kid, Washington's governors were almost entirely Republican. But I do, and then of course we had really famous folks like Slade Gordon, who were, served during the Nixon administration and voted, in fact, to impeach. So, I mean, we have a history of republicanism in this state, and I think because the state is also part of a kind of Western mythos of bootstrap pulling and independence and that kind of spirit. I'm not I'm not a believer that the Republican Party is dead here. I just think it has to look different probably than the National Republican Party, mainly because of the demography of the state and just the realism that, 9/10 of the population is west of the mountains. And that tends to be a much more progressive part of the state. But I mean, I'm in Pierce County. Pierce County is kind of a purplish one. It's not as reliably blue as like King County, where Seattle is. So I don't think there's not opportunities. I just think that this is a very difficult era. I think if you have to try to be a moderate Republican in the Trump era, I think that's a very difficult line, and it reminds me of a really extreme version of what John McCain was trying to do to distinguish himself from George W. Bush.
Well, and I think about it coming on, the eastern side of the state, which is a completely different place, right? I can tell you, I spot at least one truck a day with an American flag hanging on one side and a Donald Trump flag hanging on the other drive by. And I'm saying that there are a lot of Republicans on the ground who are very proud to be Republicans. How that fits into a larger organizing, I'm not sure what the future of that looks like, but there's a big, visible, and loud presence, at least on the eastern side of the state.
Yeah, I think, I grew up in Yakima County. I live here in Whitman County. I'm a lifelong Washingtonian as well, except for my little bit of time in the Midwest, which Illinois was a lot like Washington State in terms of sort of the political, we're the downstaters, or we're the Eastern Washington people. But I think it's just not in style to be a moderate Republican right now. We didn't see hats and flags for George Bush. We didn't see hats and flags for Ronald Reagan. That kind of Republican didn't exist back then. And maybe it's just maybe I was a naive kid, or maybe it is true that it is right now in style to be on the far right. And, this isn't my analysis. I've talked to people who are covering the gubernatorial election. They don't think Lauren Culp would have earned the Republican nomination, so to speak, in any other year. Other than this one. And so it's really interesting, and it'll be interesting to see what the results are. I mean, you kind of set it up, Michael, at the beginning of this. You chose not to do this forum during a gubernatorial debate for specific reasons. I'm the journalist here, so I don't want to reevaluate those reasons. But yeah, it's really interesting how things have changed in the last 4 years. If you're a Republican, you're a Trump Republican, or maybe the party as a moderate is dead for the moment, needs to be resuscitated.
Yeah, and personally, I'd like to add in and maybe a slight disagreement of the East-West divide in Washington State, but I see it more of an urban and rural divide. I grew up and I'm currently living in Lewis County, which is in Western Washington, but still a very conservative area, and we have Jamie Herrera Butler as our congresswoman, who is Republican. And a very interesting voice in this whole conversation is Chris Vance. He was the chair of the Washington GOP, and he left the Republican Party because of the whole Trump movement. He kind of renounced them, and he's part of the Lincoln Project now. And his view on things that I've been able to glean from following him and hearing him speak at a couple of events is Washington really has to be different for the Republican Party. They have to distance themselves from Trump if they want any hope of surviving. And I think young people too, like we are definitely a lot more on the left than on the right, typically. And so as time goes on, the state of Washington and the United States, I think, will move to the left. So if the Republican Party wants to survive, they'll have to adapt in that way.
Thought I had unmuted myself. So we have one last question here from Andrew, and he wants to know, and we kind of touched on this already, are there any other differences between the candidates that we should know about, things that you think might make the difference for undecided voters?
This is a really hard one. I know we just addressed it, and I'm trying to think of an analogy to make it make sense. This might be a bad one, so you can mute me if I say something that's off the wall here. You're picking between Bernie and Hillary, almost. You're going for the person who's on the very far left, who universal health care, tax the wealthy. You have a candidate who maybe both believe that in some way, but one of them is running on that, and that's Marco Elias. I think you're going maybe the more moderate side, not the Democrat answer to the Trump Republican, but maybe somebody who's a little more slow moving when it comes to some of those same issues. But that would be Mr. Heck. That's sort of my read on this particular race.
Yeah, and also just in terms of experience, there's difference there. Denny Heck is a congressman in our federal government, whereas Marco Elias is a state senator. And I've seen arguments from both camps of how that experience prepares them very well for this job. And I'm sure they'll be talking about this in the debate. And yeah, the Fuse Progressive Voters Guide was brought up earlier. I agree that it does a great job at laying out the differences between the two. And even Fuse, which is a progressive organization, did not endorse one candidate over the other. They officially said that they think both candidates would be great for the state of Washington. So yeah, very excited for this debate and see what they're able to bring up and differentiate themselves with.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to end tonight with a couple things. First of all, I'm going to share in the chat information about how you can watch the debate tonight. So there's information both for the western side of the state, and if anyone's watching us on the eastern side of the state, you can watch on these channels. Also, just for fun, I have a poll that will ask you, if we can pull that up here, who you currently support in the lieutenant governor race. So if you can take a minute and fill that out, we can see where our audience is at. Okay. Do we have our results? Okay, it's close. Denny Heck with 60% of the vote. Mark Elias with 40% of the vote. I wish we could do a pre and post test to see if anybody's attitudes change after the debate, but unfortunately, we won't be watching this together as we would be if we were all on campus right now. And so I want to thank all of our panelists again for the great conversation. I hope you can all join us this evening. We're going to be live tweeting the debate using the hashtag WALEX hashtag, so it's WALEX. So we'll be joining folks statewide talking about what is happening during the debate. So join us in that space on Twitter, and we'll keep the conversation going. Other than that, again, thank you to our terrific panelists. Have a great evening, enjoy the debate, and most importantly, vote. And so we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.